Now that the official translations have finally been released, I think that it's quite important if we have another reread of the One Piece chapter. And this time, we'll try to see it with a more accurate understanding of the story at hand, especially with like the newer translations. And on a personal note, oh man, this chapter really brought out such deep feelings of nostalgia and hype, especially because it kind of answered a lot of the questions that I've always had and questions that I've always wondered about the giant universe of One Piece. And some of these were like Shanks' true powers, the true level of power of admirals, that pesky ancient weapons theory that always resurfaces on YouTube, the usage of haki, and also the mystery of Shanks' character finally being revealed to some degree. Now, there's a few points I want to get through, but firstly, this chapter really solidifies that uncertainty that we all have about Momo being a worthy leader or not. And this chapter really demonstrates his resolve as a character and how much he has grown throughout the series. And throughout this chapter, we're able to see that Momo really has transformed as a character ever since the first time we met him and he was a dragon form. Well, this chapter really revisits that dragon form many times. And it's even more prevalent that when we first see Momo on Punk Hazard, even visually, he seemed like a very small character, a very small, weak character, and almost like a dragon that seems to have failed at becoming an actual dragon. And this is demonstrated via his color scheme, in the anime at least. I'm not too sure about the manga. I think the manga also visualizes him as a dragon that is pink, not so much like Kaido, which is, you know, all forms of blue and green and yellow, making him look really badass. Now, Momo as a pink dragon has always seemed to be something that Oda has included as somewhat a destined failure. Like, I do remember Caesar even saying that, you know, the fruit that Momo ate was in fact a failure because it didn't really produce the results that he desired. Now, when we compare that Momo to the Momo of today, or the Momo of chapter 1055, if we draw some parallels, we start to realize that yes, Momo was affected by the age fruit, which allowed him to grow faster than expected, having to kind of almost catch up on all the time that he has skipped. This has in fact also changed the size of his dragon, and I'd like to kind of explore that. You know, I kind of like to explore that idea of him growing as a character, not just physically but also mentally and also spiritually as a future leader and future king, future emperor of Wano. And throughout the entire fight, throughout the entire battle of Wano, we slowly start to see Momo improve in his abilities, in his fighting abilities, and also in his resolve, also in his courage. Now, if we remember, Momo has always been someone who has been very, I suppose, timid and cowardly. And it is through this arc on Wano that seemingly changed that, has noticeably changed that. And Oda has done this in such a way that we almost started to feel pity for him when we first met him, and then he got annoying and got on our nerves a bit with his cowardice, especially because if we compare him and Luffy, Luffy is a symbol of courage and never backing down, never giving up, especially for those around him. And I do believe that Momo kind of sees this in Luffy and decides to almost want to imitate that to some extent. But I think Momo as a character has always been more of a coward than more of a leader. And I don't think that Oden ever really got a chance to realize that, or at least Oden never really got a chance to kind of nurture that leadership within him. So fact of the matter is he's still a child, right? So the fact that he had to suddenly grow up in order to help Luffy fight the war, a lot of things have to change within his mind as well. And I think in this chapter especially, this is a very transformative chapter for Momo's character. And we could almost see a strong symbolism in this chapter that kind of metaphorically symbolizes this growth. And this growth is visually noticeable in the form of his fire breath. Now, throughout this chapter, or at least throughout the last few chapters, when Green Bull started to invade Wano in order to take the head of Luffy, we see these familiar characters come out and try to fight him and try to stop him, including Momo. And Momo said something in chapter 1054 where he constantly told Yamato to not fight. And a lot of us were wondering, why is that? You know, like why would Momo tell Yamato not to fight? Especially since Yamato is probably one of the stronger characters in the Wano arc. And this is revealed in 1055, and it really reveals something that kind of transforms Momo into not just a little weakling anymore, but someone who is fit to lead, someone who is fit to give down his life for the sake of his country, which is something, if you think about it, very mind-blowing to the audiences of One Piece. Especially because we seem to still be very ingrained with the fact that Momo is just a very scared kid, right? And only his physical form has changed. And throughout the Battle of Wano, we still see that he's been crying and sobbing, but what we may have not noticed is that he never really ran away anymore. He always stood his ground, and a huge part of that may be because of Yamato as well. Now, I also think that the reason that Momo told Yamato not to interfere is because Yamato is essentially going to be part of the crew of the Straw Hats. And when Momo says that he needs to be able to defend his country, or at least the retaining members need to be able to defend the country from harm and from enemies and from other forms of evil, this also demonstrates that he has finally understood the power of his own resolve. He has finally understood his responsibilities as a leader, as a king. And this is when we start to see that his fire breath also evolves as well and almost emerges from him as a symbol of his strong resolve, as a symbol of his courage and passion for his people and no longer himself. He no longer cares about the fear that he has within his heart, and instead decides to place and prioritize his love for his people. And that it also represents that he has finally detached himself from his caretakers and guardians and no longer needs them, and has grown as an individual who is worthy of being strong, independent leader and king that he was supposedly destined to do. Now, another element of this chapter that I really want to explore is the symbolism of the tree. And we have seen Green Bull's power for the last couple of chapters already, and we have seen him to be a character who is extremely strong, who is extremely versatile, and a force to be dealt with. Now, I wanted to draw attention to the symbolism of the tree, mainly because it reminded me of something that I've seen in the past in another shonen manga, aka Naruto. Now, before people start saying, oh, you know, Naruto and One Piece are totally different, and Naruto is fucking shit and One Piece is so much better. Well, I kind of agree with you there, but the fact of the matter is, I think it's also interesting to note similarities between the tree, that giant tree in Naruto during the last war. I can't really remember what it was called. I think it was the Ten Tails. I think the Ten Tails became a tree or something. I can't remember. Do you think that there are a lot of parallels here that kind of seem to be interesting to talk about? Now, the symbolism of the tree seems to be quite revisited, right? And it always seems to be a symbol of insurmountable dread. For example, in Naruto, it was basically the end of the world where the tree emerges and kind of decides to overwhelm all of its foes, right? And trapping them in some sort of dream state. And it also seems to be something that seemingly absorbs the life force of its foes. And we also see that this is also the case in this chapter when Green Bull shoots a root into Raizo and starts absorbing all his energy. Now, additionally, in both mangas or in both animes, they are both overwhelmed by the passion of a single foe, as in the tree. The tree is overwhelmed by the passion of a single character. So in Naruto, it was Naruto with his fire Rasen Shuriken that allows him to cut down the tree, which subsequently gets absorbed by Madara, but that's beside the point. And in this one, we see Momo with his devastating fire breath. And I do see that there's a parallel with the motif of the fire, right? And I think that's interesting, but it's also pretty obvious that a tree would burn down with fire. So that may just be the extent of that reference. But I did take a bit more of a look into it, and it seems like there is this tree in Japanese folklore called the Juboko actually. And also a symbol of the Japanese dragon is also an interesting concept to explore, especially in Japanese mythology. When I looked up Japanese dragons, this is what they basically resemble within the Japanese culture and within the Japanese history. So Japanese dragons are generally protectors of mankind, and they're powerful and wise guardians that shield people from universal dangers and also impart their wisdom. And they are also a symbol of good fortune, they bring happiness, and they also offer strength and courage, which are all very important aspects of human lives. And then the juboko, which is actually a tree in Japanese folklore. Now in this folklore, it seems to only appear when former battlefields where many people have died, okay? And this is interesting in the story of One Piece because Green Bull is the one that suddenly arrives right after a giant battle, one of probably the biggest battle of the decade, right? Probably not as big as the Marineford War, but probably on an equal amount of power, like in terms of power levels. And it's interesting that the tree of Juboko, it seems to characteristically suck up large quantities of blood from the dead, and it lives on human blood. And what happens is when a human being happens to pass by, the tree supposedly captures the victim and changes its branches into the shape of a tube and sucking the blood out of the victim, basically sucking out the life out of the victim. And I genuinely think that Oda did this on purpose. Oda did this on purpose to kind of symbolize that Green Bull is a character that resembles this tree that seems to want to suck out all the good fortune, all the happiness, and all the strength from the people that have just survived such a huge battle. And this is very, very, I guess, noticeable, right, in this chapter, for both characters, for Green Bull and Momo. Now, Momo as a Japanese dragon, right, like what we said before, he is a symbol of good fortune now, and he has been offering his strength and courage, even though before he used to be this giant coward. But now he is aiming to become this powerful and wise guardian, is shielding the country from universal dangers. And he's also gained this wisdom of thinking ahead, thinking that, well, if Yamato and Luffy come running towards Green Bull and helping us out, we would never be able to grow as a nation in order to defend our nation from these evils. We need to be able to act independently, to act with autonomy, and be able to bring peace to our nation without the help of others. Now, another interesting point that I also pointed out when I was reading through the chapter, maybe like the fourth time, when we see Shanks being revealed, and when we see Shanks reveal his power, I suppose, and he has basically captured Green Bull using his presence or using his haki, right? We see that he refers to Luffy and the new era of pirates. He refers to them as new shoots. Translation that we read that was released week. They didn't really determine what Shanks said as new shoots. I think they said something like new, new characters, or like just like a new race of pirates, right? In the official translation, he actually says new shoots. And I find this very, very interesting because shoots usually represent something to do with growing, right? Shoots usually represent something to do with when you plant a seed. When you plant a seed, the seed grows out into this tree, right? But during that process, it has to first come out from the ground as a shoot. And I like how Shanks has kind of mentioned this, almost as if to reference Green Bull's power. And even if we just take a few steps back and look at the previous pages, or I guess so the previous page, we see that right after Momo obliterates Green Bull, he emerges from the ground as a shoot. And I think this is very symbolic as well, because it almost kind of determines that the presence of Green Bull in this given moment in this storyline, it seems like it was beneficial to the reader that he appeared, because even though he's on this course of destruction, Oda has used Green Bull's devil fruit power to kind of bridge that idea that the new shoots, or as in the new seeds, are going to take over the old trees. And the fact of the matter is, I also think that Shanks is using the term new shoots to almost mock Green Bull's devil fruit power, in almost stating that his power, although it's all these like giant trees and all these giant branches, you almost have to always remember that all these giant trees all came from a tiny little shoot that emerged from the ground. And I also think that this spoke to Green Bull as well as a character, because he later on says that, okay, fine, I won't fight them, not yet. I think what he's saying is that I will let these shoots grow out a bit before I once again emerge and try to take the head of Luffy. And I don't know, I think what Oda does here is actually very, very interesting. Even though it's very subtle and I don't think a lot of people picked up on it, I think it's really good storytelling and it's really good word use in kind of setting a tone for what is about to happen in the next arc of One Piece, which is probably a lot of growth and a lot of character development, to the point where we can actually see Luffy as someone who can replace Shanks even, or I guess replace Goldie Roger. Now here are also some other little, I guess not so little, just some other observations that I have made reading through this chapter. Now, I've always had the question about haki, right? In this chapter, we actually see Shanks release his haki to the open for the first time, I suppose. I mean, we did see him kind of show this off during the encounter with Whitebeard, but that being said, we've never seen him use haki in a way that the audience could actually see him in battle, I suppose. And what kind of stood out to me was the fact that he was able to use his Conqueror's haki in a way that it was almost as if it was directed by some invisible force. Because when we see Luffy or other people use Conqueror's haki, it seems to emerge from the center of their being in a very cone-like shape, right? It doesn't seem to be directed, it doesn't seem to be aimed or anything. It just seems to have an area of effect kind of effect. But what I've noticed in this chapter is that not only does Shanks' Conqueror's haki seem to literally neutralize Green Bull's devil fruit power, it also seems to be carried by the observation haki. And why I say it like this is because the moment Shanks uses his Conqueror's haki, first of all, we see Green Bull's devil fruit power immediately disappear, and also we also see him communicate with Green Bull. Now, the only real way Shanks would be able to communicate with Green Bull over such a vast distance would be if he was using his observation haki, kind of like how Enel used his observation haki to tap into the voices of everyone on the Sky Island. And I think it is quite speculative to maybe think that Shanks has combined all three hakis into one. So he uses his Conqueror's haki as a weapon, and then he uses the hardening haki as a way to neutralize devil fruit powers, and then he carries both of those using his observation haki in order to almost snipe Green Bull halfway across the island. And another element of the chapter also made me think this way, where we see the sound of scree resembling almost like a radio chatter signal, and it kind of almost confirms that Green Bull and Shanks are communicating via haki. And I don't know, I think this might be something that we may be able to see further into the future. What I would like to remind everyone is also that when Luffy was fighting Kaido, he did mention that all big battles from now would all be about haki, and haki is something that seems to be underrated so far as something that helps with devil fruit powers. But I think in this next arc, we need to start thinking of it more like haki is something that is primary, and the devil fruit power is something that is secondary. And finally, there's this one last thing that me and my friend actually saw and completely blew us out of the water. There's this panel where we see Shanks talking about the new era, and before he starts talking about it, we see a collection of flashbacks where we see Luffy, we see Momo, and we see I do believe it's Hiyori-sama, and then we see a silhouette. And recently the movie One Piece Red is about to come out, and it's already been revealed that Shanks's daughter is within it. And if we take a look at Shanks's daughter's image and we compare it to the silhouette, it's almost conclusive that it confirms that Yuta is Shank's daughter, but not only that, it also concludes that Uta may be canon. It may be a canon character, because if we look closely to the silhouette, we can almost see Shanks's hand almost about to embrace Uta as his child. And if we take a side-by-side picture of Uta's character, especially her hair, we see that in the silhouette, we also see a silhouette of his hairstyle as well. And I don't think that is a coincidence. I think Oda is trying to tell us something in the most subtle, cheeky way. Now, what are your thoughts on this chapter? Feel free to leave some comments down below, and if you'd like to subscribe for more content, please do so as well.